In this week's lecture, we looked at states, nations, and nation-states. The learning outcomes for this week, there were 3. Students will hopefully gain an understanding of the role of the state in international relations. Students will develop an awareness of the idea of the discussion of identity. And students will be able to discuss the idea of identity in relation to key theories of international relations that we've discussed throughout the course, in particular realism, liberalism, and micropolitical theories of IR. So, to start off, we're going to look at definitions of state, nation-state, and nations, and these will follow sequentially throughout the lecture. Then we'll look at the role of the state as a concentration of power, as an ethical system, and as a social welfare system. We'll then go on to touch on the idea of nation-states, and from there look at nationalism and self-determination within the context of a nation. What we know about the state in IR so far, and this is drawing on the weeks that have come before us, is that the typical description of a state in international relations revolves around territory, the idea that the state is a territorial-based political unit. It has a central decision-making mechanism, a government, and an enforcement machinery, a military. States are legally sovereign, inasmuch as it doesn't recognize an internal equal or an external superior, so it can do what it wants. States then exist in a system of similarly composed territorial, political, and sovereign units. And this comes out of the week that we talked about world order and sovereignty. So, we began by a discussion of what the state does for us. And the answers that we quickly came about was the idea of make us feel safe and make us feel secure, although there were some problems within that. I then go on to give you a definition of the state. First, we have Sweeney, 2005, saying that a state is a political entity that is coterminous with a territory and represented by a government as having legitimate authority or sovereignty over that territory and the people who live in it. We then went on to talk about the definition offered by Davies, 1996, which says that a state is a centralized administration applying common laws uniformly to all citizens over the whole territory. And we had a discussion about how these definitions are similar and how they are different before we went on to look at the Montevideo Convention on Rights and Duties of States, looking in particular at Article 1, which says the state as a person of international law should possess the following qualifications: A permanent population, B, a defined territory, C, government, and D, capacity to enter into relations with other states. And we did spend some time discussing what it was to be a person and a state and the differences within that. And we did talk about that within the context of emotions and world politics. Quickly then, we went on to talk about the idea of the state as a concentration of power, and we looked at the idea of Machtpolitik proposed by Trotsky. The state in this concept raises taxes, and it does this with a very specific purpose, to be able to conduct war. But within that, there are some complementary activities. The idea that you use violence and warfare in particular to enlarge territory and your tax base, and this again goes to a demonstration, an ability to show the power and the abilities of the state, and we talked about that in the context of our lecture on world order. We then also looked at the relationship between being able to tax individuals and the ability to grow an army or a military machine, and what that means for the state as well. What we did have a discussion about was how this is a very militaristic account of the state and what this means in the context of power, but also within a realist interpretation of international relations. Building on this, we then went on to look at a definition put forward by Weber, because he puts forward not only an account of the idea of the state as power, but he couples this with a notion of responsibility. And then we went on to talk about how the state may in fact, and does in fact, possess monopoly of a legitimate use of violence within a defined territory, but that the state is an institution which is legitimized by its people to represent them and to act on their behalf at home and abroad. And we did spend some time in the context of the definitions that opened this lecture talking about government and how they become legitimate in the eyes of the people. But all of this has a couple of correlated ideas that need to be recognized. The state is then a representation, or it has a representative function. And this ties into how we think of community and what we mean by nation, and we unpack these later on in the seminar. We then went on to talk about the idea of an ethical state, and we drew on the ideas of Hegel and his Rechtsstaat. And he says that the state is a forum in which people can resolve the contradictions and tensions of social life. So the state then becomes very instrumental. It enables people, or it helps people to live an ethical life. So the state has an important educative function as well, because it's offering rules and guidelines on how to do this. Now, this idea of the ethical state then grows in importance, and it does come to be tied with various nationalist movements of the 19th century. And it is within this experience that we have the emergence of the nation state. And we went on to talk about what this means and the idea that the only legitimate form of a state is a state that embodies and represents the nation. And then we had a discussion about what this means in the context of ethical international relations and normative notions of communitarianism and communitarian ethical theories. We then went on to talk about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, 1789, and it is within this document that we get the following idea. The source of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body of men, no individual, can exercise authority that does not emanate from it. And we talked about the idea of the nation, and we contrasted that with the idea of the state. We then went on to look at the ideas of Anthony Smith, who provides a very well-referenced idea of what the nation is, and he gives us a couple attributes: common myths, shared history, common public culture, occupation of homeland, common rights and duties, and a single economy. Now, he goes on to suggest that the nation is a named human population which shares myths and memories, a mass public culture, a designated homeland, economic unity, and equal rights and duties for all members. And this is a 1995 publication. What becomes really important, though, is the fact that a nation is not a state, and it is not an ethnic community, and you need to be careful of these distinctions. Going further along down the road of what a nation is, we then looked at the idea put forward by Joseph Stalin, that a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. This was then compared to the ideas of Benedict Anderson, who said the nation is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Now, Max Weber then goes on to say that a nation is just having language, religion, territory is not enough to include some nations. And we talked about this in the context of what it was to have multiple nations living within a state. So the question that we discussed for a couple minutes was, what is the difference between a state and what is the difference between a nation? And it was suggested that to be comfortable with this question and to be able to answer it would be helpful, a way of preparing and revising to make sure you understood what was being talked about. And the reason why the distinctive definitions become important is because at some point they do actually join together. The nation state is the ideal of joining notions of nation and state together, and this can happen in one of two ways. A state is created by a nation that wishes to govern itself, or the creation of a nation state is when one diverse people within a state learn to identify with another and in the country in which they reside. Now, nation states are represented in international relations by many symbols: flags, national anthems, national currencies, national animals, and you get this like eagles, bears, and dragons. Now, this was roughly where the lecture ended, but we did have a very quick discussion about what is Wales a nation or a nation state, because this question was posed previously in another lecture, and we offered up the following answers to that question. So, a nation. Wales is one of 4 constituent countries of the United Kingdom. It has a cultural, it's united by a collection of people with shared values, traditions, history, geography, and language and religion. But it is not a nation state because it is part of the United Kingdom. It is not self-governing, although it does have devolved governing powers. So, the wider thing is to know that the United Kingdom is not a nation in the traditional sense. It is, in actuality, a state of nations.